What if I told you that a nation's doom was sealed before its first breath? In the shadow of history's most infamous destruction, as sulfur and fire still rained upon Sodom, a child was conceived who would spawn an entire people, cursed from their very genesis. His name was Moab, and the prophets would one day declare, Moab will be destroyed and become desolate forever. But here's what will send chills down your spine. Every single prophecy came true. A sorcerer hired to curse Israel ended up blessing them instead. 4 times. A king so desperate to save his kingdom that he burned his own son alive on the city walls. Ancient oracles carved in stone that archaeologists discovered thousands of years later, confirming the Bible's account word for word. And strangest of all, a Moabite widow who defied her nation's curse to become the great-grandmother of kings and an ancestor of the Messiah himself. How did prophets see Moab's end centuries before it happened? What dark god demanded children as offerings? Why does the land of Moab remain eerily desolate to this very day? The answers lie in a story so precise, so prophetically accurate, that it defies coincidence. This is the untold chronicle of Moab, where every prophecy, no matter how impossible, found its fulfillment. The sky had turned dark with smoke, and the smell of burning sulfur filled the air for miles around. Lot stood at a distance, watching the only home he had known for years disappear in flames. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were gone, completely destroyed by fire from heaven. His wife had looked back despite the angel's warning, and she had become a pillar of salt on the road behind them. Now, Lot was left alone with his 2 daughters, 3 survivors in a world that seemed to have ended. The Bible tells us in Genesis 19:30 that Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountains, and his 2 daughters were with him, for he was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and he and his 2 daughters dwelt in a cave. Fear had gripped Lot's heart. Even Zoar, the small city that had been spared at his request, no longer felt safe. So he took his daughters and climbed into the mountains, finding shelter in a cave. They were cut off from civilization, isolated in the rocky highlands with no one else around. The smoke continued to rise from the valley below, a constant reminder of the judgment that had fallen. Every day, Lot and his daughters could see the devastation stretching across the plain. The fertile valley that had once been like the garden of the Lord was now a wasteland of ash and ruin. No travelers passed by their cave. No merchants came with news from other lands. As far as they could tell, they were utterly alone. In the darkness of that cave, Lot's eldest daughter began to worry about their future. She looked at her father, growing older each day, and at her younger sister, and a desperate thought formed in her mind. Genesis 19:31 records her words, "Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come into us, as is the custom of all the earth." She believed they were the last people alive, that no men remained to marry them and give them children. The family line of their righteous uncle Abraham would die with them in this cave. So the firstborn daughter devised a plan that would shock anyone who heard it. She shared her scheme with her sister, and that very night, they put it into action. Genesis 19:32-33 tells us what happened. "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father." So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. The next morning, the eldest daughter told her sister that the plan had worked. Genesis 19:34-35 continues, "It happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, 'Indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father.' Then they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Months passed, and both daughters discovered they were pregnant. When the time came for the eldest daughter to give birth, she had a son. Genesis 19:37 records this moment. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The name Moab literally means from father, a name that would forever mark the unusual circumstances of his birth. This child, born from such a troubled beginning, would become the father of an entire nation. The Moabites would trace their ancestry back to this moment in the cave, back to Lot and his desperate daughter, back to the days when Sodom and Gomorrah burned. As Moab grew to manhood and had children of his own, his descendants began to multiply. They couldn't stay in the cave forever. The family needed space, resources, and a land they could call their own. So the children of Moab began to migrate eastward, away from the ruins of the plain, searching for a territory where they could build their future. They found what they were looking for east of the Salt Sea, the body of water we now call the Dead Sea. This region offered everything a growing people needed. The land rose sharply from the Dead Sea shore, climbing thousands of feet into plateaus that caught rain and supported vegetation. Deuteronomy 2:9 mentions this territory when God spoke to Moses centuries later. "Do not harass Moab, nor contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot as a possession." The area that became Moab's homeland stretched from the Arnon River in the north to the Zered River in the south. These natural boundaries helped define their territory. The land featured rolling hills, valleys suitable for growing grain, and pastures where sheep and goats could graze. Underground springs provided water, and the elevated position gave them a strategic advantage. over anyone who might attack from the lowlands. The climate was favorable compared to the desert region surrounding them. Rain fell during the wet season, allowing the Moabites to grow wheat and barley. The highlands protected them from the worst desert heat, though summers were still hot and dry. In this land, Moab's descendants could thrive and grow strong. They were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, which meant they carried a connection to the family God had chosen to bless. Yet they would forge their own identity, separate from their Israelite cousins who would come later. But the land east of the Dead Sea wasn't empty when Moab's descendants arrived. A fearsome people already lived there, and they had to be dealt with before the Moabites could truly claim the territory as their own. The Bible calls these original inhabitants the Emim, and they were not ordinary men. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 describes who these people were. The Emim had dwelt there in times past, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. They were also regarded as giants like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim. These were huge men, a race of giants that struck terror into anyone who saw them. Their very name, Emim, came from a word meaning fearful ones or terrors. When you stood next to an Emite warrior, you had to crane your neck to look up at his face. Their strength was legendary, their fighting abilities unmatched by normal men. For the growing nation of Moab, these giants represented an enormous obstacle. How could regular-sized people hope to drive out warriors who towered over them? How could they defeat men whose strength seemed superhuman? Yet somehow, the Moabites succeeded where others would have failed. Deuteronomy 2:11 adds a crucial detail, but the Moabites call them Emim. The use of past tense tells us something important. The Emim were no longer there. The Moabites had a different name for them, a name from their own language, because they had conquered these giants and taken their land. The Bible doesn't give us the details of how this happened. We don't know if there was one great battle or many smaller conflicts over years. We don't know the strategies the Moabites used or how many lives were lost in the struggle. But the result is clear. The descendants of Moab drove out the Emim and became the undisputed masters of the land east of the Dead Sea. Where giants once ruled, Moab's children now built their homes and raised their families. The fearsome Emim passed into memory, and a new nation took their place. With the giants gone, the Moabites could finally build in peace. They didn't just set up temporary camps or wander from place to place. They established permanent cities with strong walls and organized communities. These cities would become the centers of Moabite power and culture for centuries to come. One of their most important cities was Ar, mentioned multiple times in Scripture. Numbers 21:15 speaks of the slope of the brooks that reaches to the dwelling of Ar and lies on the border of Moab. Ar served as a key settlement, possibly even serving as a capital at various times in Moabite history. Its location near the border made it strategically important for defense and trade. Another major city was Kir Hareseth, sometimes called Kir of Moab. This fortress city sat on a high ridge, making it extremely difficult to attack. Isaiah 16:7 would later mention it when prophesying about Moab's future. Therefore, Moab shall wail for Moab, everyone shall wail. For the foundations of Kir Hareseth you shall mourn, surely they are stricken. The city's name meant city of potsherds or fortress city, and it lived up to that name with massive defensive walls. The city of Dibon also rose to prominence among the Moabites. Numbers 21:30 references it. We have shot at them. Heshbon has perished as far as Dibon. Later, this city would become so important that a Moabite king would erect a monument there, recording his victories for all to see. Archaeological excavations at Dibon have uncovered remains of the ancient city, confirming what the Bible tells us about its existence and importance. These cities weren't just random collections of houses. The Moabites built walls around them for protection, dug cisterns to store water, and created systems to manage their communities. They constructed homes from stone, using the abundant limestone found in their territory. The cities had gates where elders met to discuss important matters and where merchants gathered to trade goods. Markets bustled with activity as people bought grain, wool, pottery, and metal tools. As the Moabites built their cities and established their nation, they also developed their own religion. They didn't worship the god of their ancestor Lot. Instead, they turned to other gods, and one deity stood above all others in Moabite devotion. His name was Chemosh, and he would become the defining feature of Moabite religious identity. Numbers 21:29 calls the Moabites the people of Chemosh, showing how closely this nation identified with their god. The verse states, "Woe to you, Moab! You have perished, O people of Chemosh." This wasn't just one god among many for the Moabites. Chemosh was their national deity. The divine being they believed protected their land and gave them victory in battle.
What if I told you that your failure today was signed in blood thousands of years ago? In the suffocating shadows of a cave reeking of sulfur and the charred remains of Sodom, a fetus was conceived not in love, but in the frantic primal terror of extinction. This was the birth of the Doom Protocol. Lot's daughters weren't just sinners. They were traumatized survivors of a cosmic apocalypse, staring at a horizon of ash and believing they were the last biological anchors of a dead world. Their survivor-esque guilt mutated into a desperate, jagged logic. To save the future, they had to violate the sacred laws of the present. They didn't just commit incest. They engineered a nation born of trauma, the name they gave the child. Moab was a cold, permanent scar, literally meaning from father. It was a biological brand, a manifesto of their desperation carved into human flesh. They created a monster of a nation just to have something to hold on to as the world burned. But here is the chilling controversy. Was this a calculated act of survival or the ultimate betrayal of the divine blueprint? Did God punish Moab for their sins? Or were they doomed from the very second that forbidden DNA was ignited in the dark? Reflect on this. If a nation born of such darkness could eventually produce the lineage of a king, is the curse in your own blood a dead end? Or a hidden doorway to a brutal redemption? The cave could not hold them forever. The from-father lineage was multiplying, and the cramped shadows of their origin were being replaced by a feral, unyielding hunger for air and earth. But the land east of the Dead Sea was not an empty paradise, it was a nightmare of biological terror. It was the domain of the Im. Scripture describes these original inhabitants as a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Enochim. These were not just large men. They were the terrible ones, a race of ancient giants whose very presence was a weapon of psychological warfare. Their shadows stretched across the plateaus like the wings of fallen gods. To any normal tribe, the Emim were a dead-end and invincible firewall of muscle and bone. But the Moabites were not a normal tribe. They were the children of the ash, born from the trauma of Sodom. They didn't just fear the dark. They were a product of it. This was not a conventional war. It was the rise of the outcasts, driven by the burning sting of being God's mistakes. The descendants of Moab realized that to survive the giants, they had to become something far more terrifying than the giants themselves. They embraced the brutality of the rejected. Imagine the slaughter. Regular-sized men, fueled by a scorched earth desperation, swarming these titans like a plague of locusts. They didn't just fight for territory. They fought to erase the memory of their own shame through the shedding of giant blood. The Moabites became monsters to hunt the monsters. They utilized the jagged cliffs and the high plateaus to trap and butcher the Emim until the fearsome ones were nothing but corpses rotting under the desert sun. Where giants once ruled through fear, Moab now ruled through a refined, concentrated cruelty. They claimed the highlands not because they were invited, but because they were the only ones cold enough to endure the cost of victory. But here is the question that should haunt you. When an outcast nation destroys a race of giants through sheer, unadulterated violence, do they become the heroes of their own story, or do they just become the next evolution of the evil they replaced? Moab drove out the demons only to build altars to a darker god, Chemosh. They traded the terror of the giants for the terror of the sacrifice. Was their victory a blessing from the Almighty? Or was it the first step in a long, bloody march toward their own inevitable extinction? If you were born into a curse, how far would you go into the darkness just to prove you have the right to exist? The blood-soaked soil of Moab is still screaming for an answer. Centuries of blood-and conquest had forged Moab into a fortress, but a new shadow was stretching across their borders, a sea of tents. A nation of former slaves who had just dismantled the invincible Amorite kings. King Balak looked out from his palace and felt a cold, paralyzing dread. This wasn't just a border dispute. This was an existential threat. Balak represents the pinnacle of political paranoia, the man who realizes that his walls, his gold, and his jagged spears are useless against a people backed by the architect of the universe. He knew he couldn't win on the battlefield. So he turned to the darkest corner of the ancient world, Death's arsenal. Metaphysical assassination. He sent for Balaam, a spiritual mercenary, a man who could manipulate the unseen frequencies of the cosmos. Balak's logic was desperate. If I cannot break their bones with iron, I will shatter their souls with a curse. This is where the story shifts from a war of steel to a frequency war. Balaam arrived, silver in his pockets and prestige on the line. He climbed the jagged peaks of Peor, looking down at the vast, orderly encampment of Israel. Balak stood beside him, trembling with a dark anticipation, waiting for the words that would rot the Israelite camp from within. But as Balaam opened his mouth to release a lethal psychic strike, something terrifying happened. The frequency of the divine intercepted the signal. The curse didn't just fail. It was hijacked. Every time Balaam attempted to vomit out a curse, his vocal cords were seized by a higher power. Instead of death, he spoke life. Instead of ruin, he spoke glory. Balak was furious, striking his hands together in a fit of impotent rage, demanding to know why his paid assassin was blessing his enemies. But the secret lies in vibrational compatibility. You cannot curse what is in perfect alignment with the source. Israel, at that moment, was a nation in a state of holy frequency. Their tents were arranged in a celestial pattern. Their hearts were synchronized with the law. The curse simply had no hook to latch onto. It hit the shield of God and reflected back as a double-edged blessing. But here is the controversial truth that will send chills down your spine. Balaam was not a hero. He was a spiritual hacker who realized that if he couldn't, he cursed them from the outside. He had to teach them how to sabotage themselves from the inside. When the oracles failed, the strategy shifted to biological corruption. He told Balak, "Don't use soldiers, use your daughters." The Moabite women were sent into the camp not with swords, but with seduction and the altars of Baal Peor. They didn't just break the Israelites' moral code, they broke their frequency. By dragging the chosen people into idolatry and sexual ritual, they forced the Israelites to disconnect from their divine shield. The result? 24,000 dead in a single plague. Balak learned a brutal lesson. You cannot hire a prophet to destroy what God has blessed, but you can tempt the blessed to destroy themselves. Reflect on this. Is the greatest threat to your life an external enemy cursing you? Or is it your own willingness to lower your frequency for a moment of forbidden pleasure? Are you currently in alignment with your purpose? Or have you left the door open for a Balaam to teach you how to fall? The ruins of Moab are silent, but the echoes of this frequency war still vibrate in the choices we make today. Do you have the courage to stay in the light, or are you secretly negotiating with the shadows for a price? The tides of war had turned into a suffocating noose. King Meshe of Moab, the iron-willed sheep master who dared to defy the northern kingdom of Israel, now found himself cornered like a wounded beast. Outside the towering walls of his last stronghold, Kir-Hareseth, stood the combined might of a terrifying trinity. The king of Israel, the king of Judah, and the king of Edom. 3 armies, 3 crowns. One goal, the total annihilation of the Moabite seed. The siege was a slow, agonizing grind of starvation and iron. The coalition had systematically dismantled the land, stopping every spring, felling every fruit tree, and burying the fertile fields under a carpet of stones. Now, they stood at the gates. Meshe, in a final act of martial defiance, led 700 of his elite swordsmen in a desperate, suicidal sortie to break the Edomite line. The clash was a symphony of screaming steel and arterial spray, but the wall of shields held firm. Meshe was driven back behind his battlements. His army broke him. His hope evaporated. It was in this vacuum of absolute despair that the ultimate sacrifice was conceived. Meshe looked at his firstborn son, the crown prince, the living embodiment of Moab's future, the one who carried the very DNA of his survival, and he chose to destroy that future to save his present. This was not a religious ritual. It was a psychological nuclear strike. Meshe took his son to the highest point of the city wall, in full view of the invading thousands. Imagine the silence that fell over the battlefield as the sun glinted off the sacrificial blade. As a father, Meshe wasn't just killing a child. He was performing a system wipe on his own lineage. He was offering the most precious currency in the universe, royal blood, to the dark, insatiable frequency of his God. Chemosh, the smoke of the pyros, the stench of burning flesh drifting over the trenches of the 3 kings. But here is the jagged truth that the history books often sanitize. The great indignation that caused the three kings to retreat wasn't out of pity or mercy. It was a visceral, bone deep repulsion. They weren't moved by the father's grief. They were sickened by the realization of what they were fighting. They saw a man so radicalized by his own darkness that he would butcher his own heir just to deny them a victory. It was a spiritual biohazard. The coalition realized that to conquer Moab now meant wading through a level of depravity they weren't prepared to inhabit. The siege was lifted. Meshe won, but at what cost? He saved his walls but incinerated his soul. Now, consider this controversy. In the brutal mathematics of ancient war, was Meshe a monster? Or was he a king who understood the terrifying price of sovereignty? We often judge the dark gods like Chemosh. But we must ask, why did the sacrifice work? Why did the sight of that blood cause three kings of the living God to turn and run? Did Meshe exploit a loophole in the spiritual law? Or did he simply prove that a man who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous entity in the cosmos? Leave your thoughts below. Did Meshe save his people, or did he curse them to a legacy of blood that could never be washed away? The walls of Kir Hareseth still stand as a silent witness to the day the future was traded for a moment of bitter survival. The story of Moab should have ended in that fire. The law was absolute. No Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, it was a spiritual blockade, a permanent quarantine on a bloodline born from ash and fueled by the blood of human sacrifice. The doom protocol seemed airtight. But then a leak appeared in the system. Her name was Ruth. Do not mistake her for a mere character in a Sunday school story. Ruth was a genetic hacker. She was a woman born under the shadow of Chemosh, carrying the heavy, traumatized DNA of a nation destined for desolation. Yet, she did the unthinkable. She looked at the wreckage of her past and chose to overwrite her own code. When she uttered the words, "Your God shall be my God," she wasn't just switching religions. She was performing a high-level bypass of a celestial curse. Ruth effectively exploited a loophole in the judgment. By aligning her frequency with the God of Israel, she infiltrated the very lineage that Moab had tried to destroy for centuries. A daughter of the from father incestuous line became the great-grandmother of King David and a direct ancestor of the Messiah himself. She proved that your origin is not your destination. She demonstrated that even the most corrupted forbidden genealogy can be resequenced through a radical act of will. But while Ruth escaped, her nation did not. Today, if you travel east of the Dead Sea, you are met with a haunting, absolute void. The prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah didn't just come true. They manifested with a terrifying, surgical precision. The bustling cities of Ar and Kir Hareseth are silent stone skeletons. The people of Moab have been utterly erased from the map of human existence. Their language is a ghost. Their god Chemosh is a footnote in dusty basements of museums, and their land is a perpetual desolation. Archaeology offers no comfort here. It only confirms the silence. We find the Meshe stele, a stone slab boasting of victories. Buried in the dirt, a final, ironic testament to a pride that was eventually crushed into dust. Moab serves as a cosmic warning. A nation can be powerful, wealthy, and ancient, but if it exalts itself against the source, it will be uninstalled from reality. Now look at your own life. Are you a prisoner of your family's failures? Do you believe you are doomed because of the blood you inherited? Ruth stands as proof that you can hack the script, but Moab stands as a reminder that the system eventually purges what it cannot align. Was Moab's total extinction a fair judgment, or was it a divine tragedy? And if one woman could change her destiny, why did an entire nation choose to burn with their idols? The ruins are empty, and the sand is shifting. The answer is now in your hands.